Good evening. Welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local History Lectures series. As part of our program, we'd like to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our building and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, Free to All. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Daniel Bolin here to talk about his book, Daniel Shays' Honorable Rebellion, An American Story. Daniel Bolin earned a PhD in American Literature from New York University. He is the author of Dangers of Passion, The Transcendental Friendship of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller, and The Love Lives of Artists, 5 Stories of Creative Intimacy. He lives in Western Massachusetts. Questions will be taken at the end of the lecture. Please mute your electronic devices. Thanks for coming and enjoy the lecture.
I'm going to do this with the microphone. Before I start talking about my stuff, I always want to say thank you to Bruce Franklin and West Palm Press because they did this really great job with the design. You know, there are, I think, 18 books in print with the title Shays' Rebellion. This story has been pretty well told. But most of the title, most of the covers are like men with guns at the courts. And it's kind of a deliberate propagandistic narrative associated with the story. So this brings it closer to the story that I found when I started digging into this, which is that these honest, hardworking, dignified American farmers had kind of a hard time. And I think that they really get that across with this beautiful George Innes painting. So Bruce also kind of let me tell my story my way a little bit. As Diane mentioned, I've got a PhD in English, not in history. I kind of approached this story as a storyteller and maybe as a poet more than as a historian. So the academic editor kind of flagged some stuff that he wanted footnotes. He wanted me to. So the title could have been A Year of Resistance, because there's kind of a natural history aspect to this story. It kind of follows the farmers through the seasons as they're staging their protests. But the academic editor was like, well, how do you know that the katydids were singing? How do you know it smelled like snow before the snowstorm? And I was like, because it's Massachusetts and because it still does that, right? So and there are, as I've learned to do this, there's a core of stuff that I want to get across in the talk, and I can probably do that in about 45 minutes. There are a bunch of rabbit holes I'm happy to go down, so I kind of save some of those for the Q&A to get to them. But I also kind of want to do this, just to open the floor and just to say in advance, like if you have questions, if something doesn't make sense to you, if you heard a different story, if something doesn't sit right, I'd rather have that conversation in real time and just kind of tell you when that part will get addressed in the story than have you kind of confused or disoriented as we're listening. So Shays' Rebellion, and if there's nothing else that comes from tonight, you please don't use that term without the quotes, because it's propaganda, and it's kind of anti-regular American people propaganda. But we'll get to that. So I'd rather make, that story has been told for a long time. It's been in the history curriculum for a long time, and people all think that they know it. And I showed up for whatever reason. It was left to me. Everything that I did was in the public domain. It had all been published. I didn't do archival research. I didn't try to go decipher that horrifying 18th century script with the enrollment records and tax records and stuff. Everything I used was in the public domain, not legally, but it had all been published. So I just told the story, which for some reason hadn't happened. So the story that you've heard The story that's being told in the Massachusetts, social studies frameworks is that the farmers in Massachusetts after the war got angry about taxes. They created some big disturbances that exposed some weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation, and this led the founding fathers to realize that they needed to strengthen the Articles and write the Constitution. And so I canceled a contract for this book with a history press that wanted to sell it. They wanted to market it as Shays Rebellion, the unrest that led to the Constitution. It's a 26-year-old editor, and I kept trying to say, that's not the story I'm telling. This is a people's history. It's what the people experienced. So when I looked into this story and started to tell it, it was actually 2012, it was 10 years ago. Bernie Sanders was fresh on the scene. Occupy was a recent thing. We Are the 99% was kind of also in mind, fairly recently. That kind of beginning class consciousness was starting to happen. So when I started reading about this story, because I lived in Amherst and Pelham was right next door, and they have a Daniel Shays highway. I came home, I was like, who's this Daniel Shays guy? Why'd they name a highway for him? So what I found when I looked into this was that it wasn't a rebellion, it wasn't an insurrection, and we'll get to that. It was 5 months of nonviolent anti-austerity protests. These people gathered in the thousands and never threw a stone through a courthouse window. There was no violence when these people were organized. There was a little, sporadic stuff happened after the movement collapsed, and we can talk about that. The people kept the state's courts shut down for 5 months, and they won reforms to everything they were looking to reform in peaceful elections in April of 1787. So they won. This should be a story about nonviolent protest and solidarity among honest Americans leading to reforms that keep the government accountable. But instead, we're given this other story, right, about these disgruntled farmers who just had to disturb the state, and now we need to strengthen the government. But let's be clear. That story is used as propaganda to say we need a strong federal government to protect against the dangers of dangerous poor people, to protect private property from the dangers of poor people when they organize. And the story that I found that I'm going to tell you guys tonight is the other side, which is regular people, not poor people, regular people. They were just cash poor. They were honest, hardworking people who were pretty in the norm, in the mainstream. Regular people sometimes need to band together and make displays in the streets to protect their property and their liberties from dangerous rich people when they take charge of government and that government becomes unaccountable to the people. So, and we'll talk about those two different strains and how those stories played against each other. Basically what happened was, as the last line here says, on the ground, the people won this protest campaign. In the national political sphere, it turned into this other beast. It turned into Shays Rebellion that motivated this movement toward a stronger federal constitution. And just to be clear too, that movement toward a stronger constitution had been afoot for 2 years before these protests started. They had been having conventions, local conventions, getting stakeholders together saying, we need to do this, we can't keep interstate trade as a disaster, currency as a disaster, we need an army, we need some way to regulate the laws across state lines. They knew that there had been a convention in the spring of 1786, I think, in the beginning, before these things even really took off. There was a movement afoot, but this story, this disturbance in Massachusetts, the way that it played out, became fodder for the elites and the wealthy merchants to say, look, we can't let this, look at these, they're in the streets, there's disruptions, it's anarchy, they're gonna overthrow the government. And that became the stimulant that finally got, and George Washington was the prize because he was in retirement at Mount Vernon, they were trying to get him off the fence, and so this story from Massachusetts and these terrifying reports of desperate and degenerate men in the streets got George Washington to say, all right, fine, let's have this discussion. The threat that the elites were advertising amongst themselves was that the farmers' protests were for use of convenience, or for purposes of convenience, were January 6th. It was desperate people trying to overthrow the government and put their own people in place. Using violence, using mob violence to do that. And we have that legacy in America. Presidential historian Heather Cox Richardson recently wrote a book called How the South Won the Civil War, which is kind of an echo of Stetson Kennedy's book, After Appomattox, which talks about how the South won the Civil War in the period between 1865 and 1877, where they nullified federal law, they chased federal authorities out, they threatened black people and made them vacate their land. If those black people went to the federal agents, they would either threaten or kill the agents. And there were whole counties where no black people voted in the South. They negated federal law and put their own people in place, using violence, using threats, intimidation. We have that legacy in America. What happened in Massachusetts, 1785, 86, 87, was explicitly not that. These were proud Scots-Irish, English settlers for the most part. They had a proud tradition that went back to England of using theatrical street protests to show the general, this thing's getting in the way, to show the general populace. This wasn't a fight for resources. This wasn't people battling back and forth in the streets for control of buildings and resources. This was a PR battle. And it took place in the media, which looks an awful lot like what it looks like today, even back in 1786. And they were fighting for the hearts and minds of the country. They were trying to decide, what kind of country is America going to be? And the people, as I'm about to start showing you, and I'm going to skip the North Carolina regulators is one of those black holes. If you want to go down that in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about it. Needless to say, the folks in Massachusetts had a long tradition that went back of proud, dignified, nonviolent, theatrical street protest. And everybody understood this as a way of saying, we don't think the government's accountable to the people anymore, and we're not going to let things proceed until they are accountable. So, what were the actual causes of this thing? There were three main strands of this. After the war, there were huge war debts. America finished the war with huge debts to foreign and domestic parties. In Massachusetts, Massachusetts sent 92,000 men to serve in 38 regiments. And by the time the war is over, Massachusetts has a state debt of 1.5 million pounds. And this was in a state that had a state debt of 100,000 pounds before the war. And this is a state where the tax receipts were normally 60,000 pounds a year. So paying back 1.5 million pounds in 4 annual payments, that's not going to go so well. And that was what the proposal that kind of kicked this whole thing off. Compounding this problem with the state debt, before I get to the trade, the way that the state debt worked, and like I said, sir, did you get I made a little bit of a timeline that's in circulation up there, but if there's a fellow behind you who's got one. And it's going to take me a few minutes to get through the first couple of items, but I want to lay this out so that we can totally put to bed this idea that the people were just angry about taxes. So when the wealthy folks in Massachusetts gave their money to this war effort, what they got back was a war bond. And that war bond promised them their money back plus 6% interest, right? So this is not giving money to a cause, this is an investment for a class of investors who have money to invest, right? But those war bonds, by the time the war is over, nobody thinks they're ever going to get paid on these things, so they abandon them. They sell them off. Oh, you think you can collect on this? Give me 20 cents on the dollar, and you can wait, and when the government ever has money again, or if they ever figure out their finances, you can go collect on it. I don't think it's going to happen, so I'll just take cash now. But those bonds stayed in circulation. And they were exchanged on exchanges whose rates were published in the papers. Massachusetts was a highly literate state. Literacy was very high, even in the remote farming towns. When people went to their pubs, the newspapers were tacked to the walls, and they could see the value of these war bonds going up and down week to week, month to month on these currents of rumors. Are they going to pay them or not? The price would go up if they thought they were going to pay, or they would go down if they're like, it's disorganized. They're not going to pay. So the question of how the state is going to solve this problem becomes a problem for the political class. John Hancock was the first Massachusetts governor, 1780 to 1785. He inherits this sorry, I need to go back because I didn't get to the bottom. 1784, the British, after the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris, the British said, if you want to be free so much, you can't trade in our ports anymore. And so what this did was deny American merchants and American exporters any income that they would have sold their goods to the Indies. And so when they were selling lumber and rough linen toe cloth or beef to the Indies, probably was for the slave trade, but they weren't bringing money back in to New England, to all 13 states, and it needs to be clearly stated, the problems that led to this stuff in Massachusetts were affecting all 13 states. It was only in Massachusetts that they drove it to this point. Those merchants, those exporters from America were not able to get money, but they had warehouses of their own filled with stuff they'd imported from England, and they had to make payments on that. So now, if they can't make their payments, those English merchants are going to come and seize their goods or force them to declare bankruptcy. So then they turn to their inland distributors, and they turn to their retailers, and then those retailers turn to the farmers and say, hey, we need some money, we got to pay up, you owe me this money, I need this money now. And so now it's in the courts, and people are taking each other to court and filing suits for debt, saying we need to collect this money. And in a lot of through a large part of the state, there wasn't enough money in circulation to pay the debts that were demanded. So that was going to become a political problem, and the governments in Massachusetts and the other state governments were going to have to pick winners and losers, or, as they tried to thread the needle of figuring out how to create solutions that wouldn't create rebellion among the people and wouldn't create a rebellion among the wealthy class either, right? So in Pennsylvania, in Maryland, in Rhode Island, same issues came up. People went to their courts, they went to their foreclosure courts, they obstructed them, and the governments said, great, fine, we don't want to do this. We're going to depreciate the debts. We're going to write the values down a tenth, a 40th, a thousandth of their worth. They said, we're not going to pressure you. You guys fought for nothing. We're not going to put this on your backs. We're not going to exploit you to pay this investor class. And they worked it out, not what happened in Massachusetts, right? So this becomes a political question. John Hancock is one of the elites, one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts, wealthy and influential, but he's also a class trader. He's kind of a populist. He wants to curry favor with the regular people, even though he's driving around Boston, one of 22 men driving around Boston in a carriage, and his carriage has this, absurd coat of arms on it. So he was somebody who liked to make a display of wealth, but also liked regular people to be included in it. So he pushed for an issue of paper money. He pushed for the ability to pay your debts and your taxes in stuff, in produce. He wanted to let the people kind of steer through this minefield of economic situations. The wealthy elites in the Senate, led by James Bowdoin and his chief advisor Samuel Adams, said, no, that's not what we should do. We need a state that's going to pay its debts, that's going to, pay the plain value on these notes and fulfill our obligations and not cheat, not, depreciate the value. We need people to pay in full. And so the way the tides were going, people were getting tired of this economic crisis. By 1785, John Hancock withdrew. He claimed his gout was so bad that he couldn't continue to run for governor. And just to be clear, I don't know how many of you guys have ever had gout, but gout is something you get from eating a diet really rich in fish and meat and protein. So it's like he's saying, well, my wealth prevents me. My toes are really swollen and painful. So John Hancock withdrew. James Bowdoin comes into power. And by early 1786, the state has passed a huge raft of taxes, or has passed laws saying that they're going to pay all of their obligations in full in 4 annual payments. And I already showed you that that was not going to work out, right? And it was just, the numbers are not going to add up. And to skip ahead a little bit, by the time all of these chases and theatrics are finished, the state in the year 1786 brought in 103 pounds of taxes. So that was one of one of John Hancock's strategies, was just let's not collect taxes. And then James Bowdoin and his, the cabal of wealthy merchants said, oh, John Hancock's denying the state income. He denied the state 279,000 pounds of income by failing to collect taxes. And they just painted John Hancock as an out-of-touch, irresponsible elite, and said, we're going to put this state on a right fiscal footing. So this is the part where I really want to completely put to bed this like farmers were angry about taxes garbage. And you'll have to forgive me because the "can you freaking believe this" tone starts to come in. And I'm going to try not to curse because I've been warned against it in general audiences, but you should be able to hear it. The farmers, so the issue of the war pay was a big part of the state's war debts. The farmers were the original creditors. They gave their service. They gave years of their lives. They marched in the cold without boots, without blankets, and they won this war against the most powerful army in the world. They expected to be paid for this as they were serving. They were not a conscripted force like the British soldiers were. They were people defending their homes, working for their government, and they expected a little bit of back and forth for that. They were first paid in worthless paper money. They were then paid in promissory notes, and the promissory notes suffered the same fate that the war bonds did. At the end of the war, nobody thought they were going to get any money for these things. They started to give them up. They just needed a couple of bucks to go back to their farms, to call their wives back from their parents' houses so that they could go up into the frontier and keep working at their woodlot and build out the house and the barn and just have the tools to do that. So they settled for 10 to 15% on the dollar, on the pound, whatever the denominations were. And that's a black hole. I can tell you who's down there. I don't like to go down there myself. I'm a storyteller, not an economist. Those notes, though, so they sold these notes to whatever they could get. 10 to 15% they got from their generals, from store owners, from financiers, and they just got their money. They went back home. They lived off the land. They brewed their own brandy. They got maple syrup. They made candles out of bayberry wax with milkweed floss wicks. They didn't want to buy stuff from the stores, but those notes stayed in circulation. And those notes are also exchanged on exchanges. And the rates of exchange are public knowledge because everybody's literate and they can see this thing happening. And so by the time James Bowdoin shows up and says, we're going to pay all of this in full, 35 men in the legislature owned 40% of those soldiers' notes. So these people are voting themselves windfall profits on speculative investments they made. And they're going to raise the money to pay themselves these windfall profits by taxing the people who fought and received those notes in the first place. So to be explicitly clear, the people were being taxed in full pounds to pay the value of their own war pay in full, a war pay that they had given up for 10 to 15% of its value. They're now being taxed to pay the full value to speculators. And just to be clear, what the next step looks like, when they can't pay those things, because there isn't enough hard coin in circulation, what's going to happen to their property? What's going to happen to their livestock? It's going to be seized by the courts. What are the courts going to do with it? They're going to put it up for auction. Well, who's buying at auction in the middle of an economic collapse in this post-war downturn? Wealthy people with cash to venture. So what the people saw, and we can get into the Scots-Irish people and the class war dynamics that surrounded this story, what the people saw was that the elites in Boston were using these economic levers to force them off their land or to make them tenants again. One of the things they feared was they were going to be brought under lordships again. They were just going to be tenants. That wasn't going to be their land. They didn't work it. They didn't make it inhabitable. They're just working and giving all of the proceeds to somebody else who lives, some remote landlord. And this didn't go over well for people who had already fought and won a war against the world's premier army, right? So this people were angry about taxes thing. We have to stop, right? And we will talk about why that would have become the story instead of this story, which again, I think we should be very proud of as Americans, right? That the honest, hardworking people trapped in the currency situation they were trapped in stood together and did not let this flagrant, outrageous injustice go through on their watch. Are there questions that I should stop and answer at any point? Because please, I'm happy to do this conversationally. I'll get through it, we'll get to all of it, but if there's stuff that's out there, I'm happy to hit it as it comes up. Or I can just keep going. So the people took this to their taverns. This is a recreation of Conkey's Tavern, which is now right on the border of the Quabbin Reservoir, which is another whole rabbit hole to go down. The stone over the mantelpiece there is original. Everything else is a recreation from the American Museum in Bath. So the people went to their taverns and they started to say, we can't put up with this. This isn't going to work. And they started to read editorials in the newspapers where their people were saying things like, I've been loaded with class rates lawsuits, pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors. My land has been sold for 1/3 of its value. My cattle's been sold for about half. I've been obliged to pay and nobody will pay me. 19 parts of the public securities were possessed by merchants and opulent gentlemen in the Maritimes who are accumulating fortunes by the general distress. And screw me for saying so, but I feel like there's some echoes of contemporary situations in some of this. The heavy burden of taxes will turn us into a miserable, cruel-hearted, and wicked people, and we should rise up and put a stop to it, some of these voices are saying, and have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collectors, nor lawyers. At our newspaper I'm out in East Hampton, and our local newspaper, the Hampshire Gazette, was founded in 1786 in September to give the merchants in Northampton a platform for calling the people lazy moochers who didn't want to work, who just wanted stuff for free, who were being agitated by foreign emissaries. Like, we call them socialists now. They called them levelers then. The fear was that they wanted to level the social classes, like level the wealth of the country, bring everybody to common squalor. Again, this is propaganda. This is not what the people wanted then, and I don't think it's what they want now, but that's something we can talk about after. The wealthy merchants accused the people of being luxurious in their diet, idle and profligate in their manners, encouragers of foreign manufacturers. And what that means, those dog whistles are saying, they buy too much rum from the Indies. You can't listen to these people. They're not legit. They're not real workers. They signed satirical letters with names like Amos Spendthrift, Tom Seldom Sober, or Simon Dreadwork. And they threatened that farmers would overturn the very foundations of our government and constitution, and on their ruins exert the unprincipled and lawless domination of one man. Right? This is the caricature that we're still hearing. It was convenient then, it did the job. But again, this isn't a battle for control of resources. This is a battle for the hearts and minds of the country. These things are happening in editorials. If January 6th had happened in the Facebook chats, nobody would have cared as much, right? But it took people into the streets, and now we got to tell the story. So the people went to their meeting houses, and I gave a talk here 2 weeks ago. This is the oldest still operating meeting house in the US. Fascinating building, fascinating history. 1743 this was built. And they started writing petitions, and most often they were farmers, and they got the most literate among them to write these very flowery petitions saying things like, we have no intention of subverting the government and throwing all things into a state of confusion. We sincerely deprecate the consequences of anarchy. We're induced by the ties of friendship and by the stronger laws which religion inculcates of doing as we would be done by. If your honors would be so kind as to consider the great scarcity of cash, we have not the least doubt, but that your honors, upon a serious consideration, will join us in sentiment. Right? So these are the people who are being accused of, wanting to tear down the government. And they're sending petitions from all those towns in green and then some. Their petitions are going to Boston by the dozen from these towns. And the legislators in Boston are just across the board ignoring them. Or if the House of Representatives is trying to do something about it, the Senate, which is a little bit more aristocratic, you have to have a higher wealth to be a senator, is ignoring it. Just James Bowdoin has already said he's coming in on a platform of paying the debts in full and kind of shafting the people to do that. So anyway, the people are sending petitions by the dozen. And so typically the date for Shays' rebellion starts July 18th. I don't know how many things we are down here on this, on my timeline there, but typically starts July 18th, 1786. The legislature adjourned and without doing anything. And the farmers all said, all right, we got to stand up. We can't let this go on. We can't let these things get passed down and drive us off of our land. So August 22nd to 25th in Hatfield, which is that blue square above the orange one, kind of in the middle, you can see the Connecticut River going down the middle of it. Northampton is in orange, Springfield is the other town in orange. Those are the court towns. And then the towns in green were a lot of Scots Irish, but also a lot of other folks, a lot of different kind of ethnicities and peoples were kind of protesting these things. You can see the geography. The higher you are, the more likely your town was kind of to send people to this. They sent 50 towns, sent delegates to Hatfield. They came up with one petition, 25 items. They wanted an issue of paper money. They wanted to be able to pay their debts in goods, not in hard coin. They wanted to move the capital to Worcester, and they pledged not to protest or interrupt anything or perform any violence until these things were heard out. They were not foolish, though, and when the first thing on the timeline after this convention happens is 4 days after it's over, there's going to be the first foreclosure court meeting of the fall session, the late summer fall session, is going to be meeting in Northampton as the first foreclosure court, where property is going to be at issue. As soon as the judge bangs his gavel, people's property is going to change hands. So they pledged to not commit any violence, but they also organized. And by the time they're done organizing, when that court opened, or when that court was scheduled to open, there were about 1,500 farmers had come down from all those towns. And these are, a day or 2 days march to get to Northampton for some of these people. They marched into the courtyards with about 1 in 4 had guns. They came in their uniforms if they had them. They came in homespun linen coats because wool was expensive and cotton was an import, and linen was something the Scots Irish had introduced to Massachusetts. They were great cultivators of linen and lace makers. They were kind of ornery people who were known for their self-reliance and having their own opinions about stuff, even in religion. So the Scots-Irish people in Pelham were the ones who led this. Daniel Shays did not lead. He was one of the heads of the militia in Pelham, and the fellow who led was a deacon, John Thompson, led about 70 men out of Pelham to go down to Northampton. They were led by another fellow from West Springfield. I can get into that rabbit hole later. They marched in, guns at their shoulders, military drums, fifes, like the whole 9 yards, making it clear that, hey, we're the soldiers who fought for your liberty. We're not being treated well. We're here to show you what proud, dignified, restrained protest looks like, and to advertise for you this flagrant injustice on the government side. And we're going to show you that we're the people by keeping our guns at our shoulders. And so what it ended up as in this courtyard was kind of a step match. The people put on their kind of parade to the left ho, to the right ho, with their fifes and drums, and then they withdrew, and then the government came and they did their performance. And the people are hearing this because it's August and everybody's windows are open. Nobody threw a stone through a courthouse window. I'll keep saying it. There was no violence when the people were organized. And the people had all fought together. The people who are on the government side had been in the revolution alongside the farmers who are now on the other side. So they have this protest. They all agree that nobody's authorized to settle this issue, so they're going to punt it. They just adjourn. The judges adjourn, the people withdraw, the government people withdraw, and we're done. But 4 days later, James Bowdoin issues this proclamation saying that the people had introduced riot, anarchy, and confusion into the state. And when he does this, what he's doing is telling the merchant class, these are no good rabble, and I will use force to subdue them if necessary. Like, that's kind of the dog whistle. That's the context for that. This is riot, we need to suppress it. This is anarchy, we need to show law and order. This is confusion, we need to shed the light of government power on this. So the people felt a little threatened, so now over the course of September 5th to the 13th, they started having, there were more courts scheduled to meet. So in Worcester, in Concord, in Taunton, south of Boston, and then in Great Barrington, again, hundreds to thousands of men showed up and said, yeah, court's not meeting today. We find it inconvenient. The people find it inconvenient to have this court hold session. And I love this story. In Great Barrington, the government people, the militia leaders, mustered 1,000 men to march into town to force the court open. And one of the judges himself, William Whiting, came out and said, well, hold on. Whose side are we on here? If you're on the government side over here, if you're on the people side over here. And when the guys were done sorting themselves out, 800 people are on the people's side of the road. When 200 of the people are looking like, whoa, what happened? Right? So the people are there to enforce the law, and they're there taking the people's side. Right? So what this did is, and I've learned with this kind of gesture, I have to be careful around this microphone, this kind of gesture does it. The people showed up with guns and military formation and discipline in their courtyards. That story is supposed to tell the people, we're the proud, dignified people who fought for your liberty. Don't let this happen to us. But when that report gets to Boston, that's telling the story, they're going to shut down our courts. They're going to take over our government. There's men with guns. It's anarchy. It's chaos, right? So everything that they did in Boston was to keep this cycle going. Every time they touched, it would just turn into more inflammation instead of any diplomacy going back and forth. So this is the part where I'm going to kind of fast forward. You guys have the timelines. I love going through this in the book. I really did love, as I said in the book, I discovered this story literally on the side of the road. It was a sign that said Daniel Shays Highway, and I was like, what's that? Who's this guy? And I was new. I was a New York City transplant, like Hudson River Valley guy, suburbs, whatever, upstate for college. So when I got to Massachusetts, this story became my opportunity to drive around to places like Petersham and Rutland, and there's a Rutland, Mass, and Brookfield, where Daniel Shays hired out his labor as a laborer before he got married and rose through the ranks to have the authority to lead people in a thing like this. So there was a point I was looping back to with that, and I think I lost it. Onward. The government's response to this, to take my last line there, I'll find it, it'll come back. After William Whiting says, all right, whose law are we here to enforce? The next day, Samuel Adams publishes a statement in the newspaper, I think in the Worcester Sentinel, saying, it's one thing to rebel against the laws of a monarchy, but he who rebels against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death. Right? So this, maybe to return to it, this story became my way of figuring out who these people are who live in this Western Mass territory. The government also then responded with now at the criminal court. This isn't a foreclosure civil court anymore. This is the criminal court in Worcester issued arrest warrants for the people who led the protest there. And then on September 21st, up the way in New Hampshire, same issue, same draconian measures from the government. A group of citizens showed up at the government's meeting and said, hey, we'd like an issue of paper money. James Sullivan was the governor there, surrounded them, arrested 39 of them, forced them to march hatless through a doubled lines of militia. So he lined all his militia up on the road and made these guys march without hats down the middle of it. It was a class war and humiliation as part of it. So these things are happening in the background, and now the people are nervous because their next court is scheduled to open in Springfield. That was down on the south, that orange box. This is how we think of it in Western Mass. Springfield is like that orange box. The next court is scheduled, the criminal court is scheduled to open in Springfield on the 25th, and now hundreds of people from the Western Mass, from what we now call the Pioneer Valley, are like, oh no, they're not. So they bring Daniel Shays in. As I said, I'm going to kind of skip fast forward over Daniel Shays. He rose through the ranks. He was the son of an indentured servant. He married the daughter of a landowner. He catapulted from laborer to gentleman farmer before the revolution. He went to war as an ensign, which is a rank above private. He came out of war as a captain. So I think that Daniel Shays is brought in because there's this huge swelling of anger from people who are maybe rhetorically floating the idea of doing something violent against the government. And Daniel Shays is brought in to say, hang on, fellas, let's take it easy. Let's keep the peace. And so after this first protest, Daniel Shays is marching with a couple hundred picked men. And their job is to keep the peace and to not let anybody lose their heads. Because in this fight, this public relations fight, and maybe we're watching it happen right now, the way that the rules for that fight are, whoever shoots loses. Whoever gets the bloody shirt from one of their men, that they can wave this in the marketplace and say they murdered us, that's what wins. And that's what ultimately did this. It's part of the logic that led to breakthroughs in the civil rights era. People were able to see pictures of the violence and like, well, that ain't right. We can't let that happen. So Daniel Shays steps forward. marches to Springfield with now, he marches out of Pelham not with 70, but with 700 men. Right, the numbers are increasing and the anger is increasing, and Daniel Shays is brought in, as I understand it, to keep control, to keep this thing from blowing up. Again, no violence, not a stone through a courthouse window, nobody went home with black and blue marks, there was no blood on the ground. This was a civil undertaking, and the people see themselves as the civilians who are keeping it civil, like that's their job, is to honor this contract that apparently their government is intent on breaking, right, with these taxes, and now with this talk of he who rebels against a republic ought to suffer death. So after this, at the end of September, the government responds by issuing a riot act. And it's hard to, can you freaking believe this tone? It's hard to keep out of this talk because these same people in Boston are running the show, are acting pretty similar to the folks who were just thrown out before they came in, right? And it needs to be said too that one of the things I think really that precipitated this crisis was that the administrative class that had run Boston and Massachusetts before the revolution, those folks were all British and they left when the war happened. And the people who came up were wealthy merchants and financiers who thought they could run shit. Forgive me. So it would basically be like, handing government over to private equity and waiting to see how well the social services are going to go and what the policy looks like. So instead of negotiating with people who just fought off the British Army, they decide that the best way to make a display is with a riot act, and they're threatening to, if you're in a crowd of 12 or more armed persons and you don't disperse, you're going to be arrested, taken to Boston outside of your country, kept there for a year, whipped 39 times every 3 months. Your land and livestock will be forfeit to the state, and I would say most inflammatory of all, and I regret to say this is something we've been hearing in the news, surrounding our protests, the government indemnified deputies against any liability if they killed or injured protesters. These are some of the things that caused the colonists to throw off British rule. They just didn't want to be put under that boot. And now here comes James Bowdoin and Samuel Adams saying, we need to make a display. And you can see them, they're not playing to the people of Massachusetts, they're playing to the elites in the other states saying, well, look at this unrest we got. We gotta do something about this. We're trying, but we can't. We need a stronger government, right? Because they know that party is out there. Alexander Hamilton is out there. Henry Knox is in Boston sending letters to George Washington. So by the end of October, this thing's only 2 months old, and he's saying, George, 12 to 15,000 desperate and degenerate men are preparing to rebel against the idea of good government. We have to reform things. And he picks Daniel Shays as the leader of this thing for reasons I'll save for the Q&A. Nevertheless, the riot act passes, they suspend habeas corpus. Now everyone's looking November 21st, so it's gonna happen that's the next showdown. They get to November 21st, the people show up, Daniel Shays comes with 350 picked men, and there's no violence. There's no showdown. There's no blood in the snow, and now there's snow in the road. The only thing that happened was at the end of November, the government men sent out 400 horsemen. They found this fellow, Job Shattuck, in Groton, and when he resisted arrest, they slashed him behind the knee. One of the Harvard graduate, John Hickborn, slashed him behind the knee with his saber and crippled him for life. And even with blood in the snow, the people kept their restraint. I love telling this story because I'm so proud of these people, and I'm proud to be an advocate for these people because in the face of all of these outrages and threats, they just waited till constitutional reforms could be arrived at. December usually gets skipped over in the histories, and I'm going to skip over it now. And the last thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to leave some stuff on the table, but the last thing I want to do is debunk the idea that is typically used to say, well, this is a rebellion. Didn't they go to Springfield to try to seize the arms to wage war against the government? No, they did not. They could have seized that armory, the arsenal, what's now the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. They could have seized that site at any time in the last 4 or 5 months. They didn't. They marched past it every time because they were not in a campaign to take over the government, to overthrow the government. When the government finally met in January, the legislature comes back into session, James Bowdoin issues a proclamation naming people for arrests and fielding an army. and he's going to send 3,000 men on snowy roads from Boston to Springfield to force the court opens and basically institute martial law and arrest the leaders. And at that point, they kind of started arresting whoever, anybody that they felt was an enemy to the state. Daniel Shays heard this news that that army was marching on January 19th. He gathered his men, 1,200 men in Pelham, north, like a day and a half's ride from Springfield. Another 400 gathered in Chicopee, just north of Springfield. Another 600 in West Springfield. They sat there and they waited. They waited for the 20th to come and go, and the 21st to come and go, and the 22nd to come and go. And they didn't move until they heard on the 23rd that General Benjamin Lincoln, this fellow, had marched out of Worcester with 3,000 men to come and impose martial law. And at this point, they say, we have to act. If they control the guns and gunpowder and cannon and provisions, we're doomed. So they marched to Springfield. They came in platoons, which I've had the good fortune to give this talk in rooms with lines of, 8 across rows. And the first 3 rows were just not annihilated by this grape shot. They marched up, they told them to stop, they kept coming, they fired warning shots over their head. This grape shot I describe in the book is steel balls bigger than thumb knuckles. It's actually balls about that big. It's packed into these canisters. It's like shotgun, just sprays out of the end of a cannon. That went over their heads. They kept their guns at their shoulders. They continued to advance. When they had asked Daniel Shays what he was coming for, he said barracks and stores. He didn't say anything about changing government. It was January. He wanted to get his guys out of the cold and give them provisions because they'd been eating out of their own basements and out of their cellars and out of their pantries, all these goods that they had just harvested that they were supposed to last them till June and July. And they'd been waging an army, supporting an army with it. So they marched up. The government, the Westfield General William Shepard, ordered his cannon crews to lower the cannon to waistband height, and they let them rip. And 3 were killed instantly. A 4th died later of his wounds, and 20 people were in the road wounded. And the Daniel Shays did not push his men forward. They did not fire their guns. They did not surround the place and start to form a military siege. They retreated to cries of murder, murder, because their guys had been shot and they were waving those bloody shirts in the marketplace saying, we have suffered an injustice here. And short story, after they were chased around, ultimately to Vermont, peaceful elections on April 1st, and the state of Massachusetts universally, like 2 or 3 to 1, drove James Bowdoin out, brought John Hancock back into office as governor, and just reformed just lifted all of the things that had been irritating the people. They just took all of those antagonisms off the books. They restored habeas corpus. He said Hancock wouldn't use tax income for paying the war debts. He would only use it for operating expenses. Those war debts would linger and function or feature in the what's known incorrectly again as the Whiskey Rebellion, when Alexander Hamilton assumed the state's war debts and decided to pay them in full, same securities, same injustice, same windfall for investors and financiers, same things, but he's going to do it by taxing the whiskey distillers in Pennsylvania. They put up a ruckus, and George Washington ended up marching 13,000 federal troops, but that's a different story. So Daniel Shays ended up in Vermont, where a New York middle school science teacher found some stones in the woods and started digging, started an archaeology camp for his students, and found all this really beautiful 18th century stuff, which they can date really, really precisely to 1787. And this is the frame that I'll leave this with. It's 10 of, so we still have a few minutes for Q&A. Thomas Jefferson hears about these disturbances in France. His response is, can history produce an instance of a rebellion so honorably conducted? God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. Right? And this is the American theory that we saw, really exemplified in the Declaration of Independence and kind of watered down in the Constitution, saying that the people have the right to choose their own government and that the government needs to be held accountable to the people. And again, the people did not throw a stone through a courthouse window. There was a bullet point where after the collapse, after they were dispersed at gunpoint in early February, there was sporadic arson. People would, it was like local score settling. People would like light, potash works were a popular target, and warehouses and such. But in terms of organized forces, there was no organized violence from the people. Nevertheless, the Constitution is written, I think, informed by this other sense you get from George Washington, saying that mankind, when left to themselves, are unfit for their own government, and we can see how the Senate is standing in the way of things that I think the people would say that they want and need now. So I did build a website for this. I know that this is in part of the Massachusetts state frameworks for middle school. If you guys know teachers who are teaching this, I'm happy to get involved. I've done some lesson plan stuff and curriculum and whatnot to get this story out. It's galling to watch this, the story is still invoked in the news as, those disgruntled farmers disrupted the government and needed to be shut down, and we need a federal government to organize that. It's still out there. It's kind of an uphill battle for me, but I did put some resources out there. If you know people who are working on this, I'm happy to answer questions now or over time if this is stuff you're interested in. So thank you for coming to be part of this story. I appreciate it. And forgive me too, I think I jumped right in, but I need to thank the library for having me. Thanks you guys. What a space to be in. Yes? Right, right. Yeah, Sam Adams is a really interesting case, and I had a hard time nailing him down because people turned him into a couple of different things for their purposes. The turning point for me would be 1782. There were disruptions in Northampton. A fellow named, on one side it's an itinerant preacher named Samuel Eli riled some folks up. But there were some structural injustices. The 1780 Constitution had some profound injustices in it. They raised the property requirement from before the war, right? Even to vote, you had to be worth 60 pounds. To be a representative, it was 100. To be a senator was 600. To be a governor, you had to be worth 1,000 pounds. And this is at a time when you could buy a farm of 100 acres for 70 pounds. So it wasn't hard to stir up some populist discontent about this flagrantly unjust. In Vermont, all white men could vote, right? In the town meetings, a lot of the towns in Western Mass, all adult men could vote. But in the state of Massachusetts, for state elections, there was now this hierarchy, that's a different story. Nevertheless, 1782, there's some disruptions. They get some people to disturb some courts, and they arrest some people, and there's some reprisals and back and forth. Everybody's on edge for a little while. Samuel Adams went for a listening tour through Western Mass to see what was really the concern. And when he came back to Boston, as I understand it, his report was, they don't really have concerns. They're just belly aching. We don't need to listen to them, right? And so that's, I think, part of the class distinction that in Boston, they're like, we don't need to care what these people think. And out in Western Mass, the people are saying, you're killing us. Like, how did this happen? So I'm still not sure I have a really great fix on Sam Adams, but that to me became the node that explained, how this person who could be advocating building the philosophical case for a change of government and for the government that we got ended up being somebody who's like, yeah, the will of the people doesn't matter. But I think a part of it was having brought in that Republican government, he did not want to see any challenges to it. So he was defending what he had built. But yes. Yeah. Yeah, I could point you to them in a couple of the sources. I think Pauline Meyer was one of the folks who dealt with him. Yep, and Woody Holton was somebody else who I think incorporated him. That might be something for me. It would be easier for me to put my finger on if I was flipping through it. But yeah, it's out there. It's out there for sure. But what else? Yes. I think, I think that it was more a matter of the fact that they showed up in kind of military formation as the people of the country. A lot of them were their town militias. And they surrounded the courthouse and they just denied people entrance into the courthouse. So the interesting moment for me then becomes, well, what happens when the government people arrive? Or vice versa. Sometimes the government would occupy the courthouse in advance and then the people would march up. But every time, there's this moment where the forces sight each other across the courtyard, nothing happened, right? So, yeah, I think that this is where that interpretation happens. This is where the people are showing their countrymen, we're the proud, dignified veterans who fought for your freedom, and the government people are saying, they're here to overthrow government. And in fairness to the government perspective, I don't know if anybody's read Ray and Marie Raphael's really excellent book, Spirit of 74. I didn't know this, and it's apparently not many other people do, that Massachusetts was functionally independent from the middle of 1774, when the British tried to clamp down after the Tea Party. They tried to, put a British administrator in every town meeting, in every local county convention. And every town west of Boston, west of the neck of Boston, when Boston was still a long isthmus going out to a little island city, every town west of Boston in Massachusetts threw off their crown-appointed administrator, forced them to resign their titles. Maybe some folks were a little roughed up, but they all resigned, and Massachusetts was administering its taxes, performing all the functions of government, measuring the fences, surveying, administering taxes, collecting the money, buying arms, preparing for this war. So when the government in Boston in 1786 is watching the people say, no, we're good, we can occupy, we can run things ourselves, we don't need what you're doing. That was following that script, right? They were like, well, we've seen this before, and we've seen how this happens. So to my mind, the best title for these events, if we're going to be politically, scientifically honest, shouldn't be Shays' Rebellion, which is clearly propaganda, and I beg you to stop using it in company. The title really should be James Bowdoin's, I would say, bald-faced land grab and counter-revolutionary panic, right? Because they're whipping up the people of Massachusetts into this frenzy that, well, if we don't suppress these protests, it's going to be anarchy, it's going to be chaos, they're going to come for your goods, everything you've fought hard to win, they're going to come and take it from you, right? And that divide and conquer language that we get with, the immigrants and dark-skinned people, they were doing it the same then. The Scots-Irish had been burned out of, they'd set up a church in Worcester that was burned down by the Protestants, or by the Puritans. These Presbyterians were ornery, they didn't want them around. They forced them out to Pelham, this like sandy, rocky hills. And what did they do there? They raised the value of the land. And so now here comes these problems, and the people are trying to seize that land and push them further west. Right? And you can see this big wave of capital and real estate development just pushing these poor farmers further and further west. And that was one of the big results of this crisis in Massachusetts, was that it emptied out the towns. I mean, people went to Vermont, which was still an independent country at the time. It hadn't become the 14th state yet. That wasn't until 1791. It pushed them to western New York, which was still being settled. It pushed them to western Pennsylvania. It pushed them to Ohio. And during the Whiskey Rebellion, when people didn't like how that got resolved, there were places for them to go then, right? So this whole thing, and in some towns in Massachusetts following these disturbances, there were reports, I wasn't there, I just read what I read, there were reports that in some towns there were not enough people to hold all the town's offices. Right? They were like, we don't want to be part of it, we're going someplace else where we can make our own laws, right? So it's part of definitely a bigger story, and of course in those other places, they were already occupied, so they needed to be emptied out, and we have those stories to tell as well and acknowledge what went on in those places. But anyway, I'm trying to put this in the bigger picture, which I think started with this question about Sam Adams. Samuel Adams, a historian barked at me about that. Sam Adams is a beer, Samuel Adams is a person. Yes, sir. So I'm going to, to be honest, I'm a writer and I'm a little opportunistic in how I tell this. I don't have the academic rigor of a historian. I'll be the first person to say it. So I follow these stories where I felt like the stories were there to be told, but to answer the question, I will tell you the story of Daniel Shays' experience, which was that lawsuits among the people themselves, between neighbors, were commonplace at the time. So when Daniel Shays fled to Vermont to get out of the state where the Massachusetts Army couldn't follow him, even by the end of the month of February, so he's only been gone 3 weeks, and 10 people, 10 men, filed in suits for debt against his property as he left it. And some of these people had followed his orders at the courts at the protests. Right? So they saw this opportunity to say, well, we got to get in, and if they're going to leave it, somebody's got to take care of it, right? And then the towns adjusted themselves. To be honest, I don't know the immediate economic aftermath. There are historians or economics storytellers who would say that a lot of the economic threats that came up, or the economic conditions that were threatened, and the men going to debtor's prison, which was a class warfare form of humiliation, right? The debtor or the creditor would pay the court to keep you in prison until your family sold enough stuff to redeem you, right? It was not just like, oh, you have this problem with the law. Like, the creditor did it to you when the debts couldn't be adjusted or to anybody's satisfaction. So on that ground level, I think people did what was in their best interests to do. There was, as I said, there was a lot of score settling. I think that those classes remained much more distinct within themselves and against each other than we recognize today. I don't think that we really think of ourselves as having classes or class interests in the same way that like the Scots-Irish did, or the former, former soldiers did. There's a historian out there, Leonard Richard's book was one of the definitive ones. He called Shays' Rebellion the last battle of the Revolution. One of his students, Richard Colton, I met him when he was the historian at the Springfield National Historic Site, the Armory, and his paper was calling this the last mutiny of the Revolution, because there were cases in the New Jersey line, the Pennsylvania line, mutinying. But what that meant was the people said, we can't take these conditions anymore. We don't have food, we don't have blankets, we don't have pay. We're out. And the government, in one case, negotiated re-enlistment bonuses. And then 3 weeks later, the second one happened, and they sent a forced march with hundreds of soldiers from Boston to New Jersey and pulled the men's leaders out and shot them. So there was a lot of, the story becomes kind of a lot of local score settling at a certain point, and it descends to this level that my storytelling, my historiography, I lose sight of it because there's just a limit to what I can do. I did go to a talk at the town of Hatfield, and it was from their historical society, and there were people at this meeting who had done the work. They could tell you which house the meeting was at, and which house the antagonists were at, and which house the wealthy merchants lived at. And when you get down to that level, the stories start to get a little confounding because they don't exactly add up to this class-based story that I'm kind of simplifying it to, with the larger brushstrokes. So I don't want to pull the rug out from under my own feet, but when you start, I'll say this, if I were, and I've done this, when you try to adapt this for the screen and turn it into a screenplay and fictionalize it, those issues get super fascinating, right? Because local people's interests, like hillside to hillside, plot to plot, become, they're just personal. They're not part of this broad narrative anymore. But that's a story for another day. And if you guys know anybody who's interested in putting this on the screen, James Franco apparently is doing this type of thing with the apple picker strike. Anyway, I can ramble on that. But who else? What else? Or should I take another question and thank you guys for coming out on this rainy early autumn day? All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to tell this story to you guys. Thank you for coming, and I hope you take it to good places with you. Thank you.